everyone, my name is Jimena, and today I want to talk about 3 reasons why Latinx characters are underrepresented in fantasy fiction. When I started this channel and my blog, I wanted to talk about the different issues that had affected my life most because of my own identity, and Latinx identity was one of those issues. But as I'm looking at the kind of books that I usually read, which are usually genre books, young adult books, fantasy books, it's hard to find anything in fantasy that represents Latinx identity. The truth is, while statistics are improving, there are very few Latinx characters in fantasy fiction. The fantasy genre, particularly the young adult fantasy genre, which is what I'm most familiar with, is quickly becoming more diverse. I mentioned a few weeks ago Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, which received one of the largest advances in publishing history, got a movie deal before the book was even published. I mean, diverse stories are getting more traction. Of course, there's still a lot to be desired, and more representation for Latinx authors and characters is definitely one of those things that we need more of. So here are 3 reasons I could come up with for why Latinx characters are underrepresented in the fantasy genre. Number 1, fantasy has a long history of racism. Of course, this doesn't just apply to the representation of Latinx people, but it applies to them in a particular way. Basically, all of fantasy being published in the United States or in the English language in some way owes a debt to the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings sort of codified a lot of what we understand as fantasy, so even if books are rebelling against the Lord of the Rings archetype kind of thing, they're still responding to it in some way. A lot of the tropes that J.R.R. Tolkien created are still being used today in one form or another. The Lord of the Rings and its descendants routinely erase people of color and instead replace them with fantastical races. Apart from coding the good guys, such as dwarves, humans, and elves, as white, light-skinned, and the bad guys, such as orcs and goblins, as dark-skinned, these races, unlike in the real world, are based in biological differences. Dwarves are naturally grumpy and greedy. Elves are wise and graceful. These essentialist distinctions mirror the way that real-world racism categorizes people of color as lazy, lustful, what have you. Racist pseudoscience has been trying to prove for centuries that there is a biological justification for race. There isn't. What's more, in Tolkien's world and in many fantasy worlds since, there's the hierarchy of races ranging from the most noble to the lowest of the low. There have been some essays that have compared this racial hierarchy to fascist narratives such as those of Nazi Germany and imperialist Europeans of the 19th century. That's not to suggest that Tolkien is a fascist, but he's definitely influenced by some of those similar ideologies. This integral part of fantasy fiction might work to exclude Latinx people in a particular way. During Spanish colonial rule, racial hierarchy was extremely rigid and systematic. There were all these different castes corresponding to the amount of mixture of different races that there existed in your blood. So you can compare this extensive terminology and pseudoscientific approach to categorizing and making a hierarchy out of different people in Latin America to what happens in these fantasy worlds. Even within one of the races in Middle-earth, wizards, color plays a huge hierarchical role because brown wizards are lower than gray wizards, who are lower than white wizards. When you compare the racial discourse of so many fantasy worlds and novels with the very real legacy of the caste system in Latin America, you can see why a lot of Latinx authors and characters might seem to be excluded from the fantasy genre. You can feel the legacy of the Tolkien-esque racial hierarchy even in other subgenres of fantasy, such as contemporary fantasy, where werewolves and vampires are a lot of times treated as if they're different races who have also these essentialist characteristics. Number 2, what does it mean to be Latinx in a fantasy world? Latin America is one of the most diverse places on the planet. Contrary to popular belief in the US, Latinx and Hispanic are not racial distinctions, but just geographic and cultural distinctions. You can be Latinx and Native, Latinx and Black, Latinx and White, Latinx and Asian, Latinx and Middle Eastern. You can be a melting pot unto yourself, tracing your lineage to multiple continents. Latinx people are united and divided by language, culture, and history, not by race. If you want to learn more about the different racial identities within Latinx identity, I'm going to link to a beautiful comic that everyone should read. So therefore, if you wanted to include Latinx people in your fantasy world, it would either have to be a world that's like ours just with magic, or it would have to be similar enough to ours that this historical phenomenon called Latin America would exist in this fantasy world. So you can understand how this would pose a specific challenge to writers of epic fantasy or fantasy set in made-up worlds, because while you can create a fantasy world that has only a passing resemblance to medieval Europe, say, and still have it represent Europeans, but you can't do the same for Latin America because Latin America is such a specific historical development. That doesn't mean it can't be done, of course. Number 3, there just aren't enough Latinx authors. It's hard to get solid data, but if you look at the breakdown of the ethnicity of authors who get reviewed in the New York Times, for instance, you see that Latinx authors are extremely underrepresented. Almost 90% of all books reviewed in 2012 were by white, I'm assuming, non-Hispanic authors. Only around 1% were by Hispanic authors, and according to Roxane Gay, who conducted the study, only one of those authors was a Hispanic woman. Also, in a study conducted by the Cooperative Children's Book Center, less than 7% of books published in 2018 were about Latinx characters, and less than 5% were by Latinx authors. If Latinx authors aren't getting the opportunity to tell stories about people like themselves, there just aren't going to be as many stories about people like themselves. Since there aren't that many Latinx authors out there, if you're not actively seeking them out, chances are you're going to miss them. In the past few years, I've made an effort to read more books by women, authors of color, LGBTQIA authors, but I haven't focused specifically on Latinx authors, and that's definitely something I want to change, especially reading more by Latinx authors of color who definitely need the most representation and their voices need to be lifted up the most. In my blog post about this topic, someone commented that magic realism was invented in Latin America, so there is a lot of rich history of magic and fantasy to draw from within literature. I think that's a really good point. However, magic realism is very different from fantasy. Magic realism falls within the literary category, and fantasy falls within the genre category, meaning that magic realism gets more critical acclaim, less popular success, vice versa. Also, Latinx and Latin American authors often get pigeonholed as only able to write magic realism, as if that's the only literary legacy that we have from our continent, which is not true. But magic realism can definitely influence contemporary fantasy writers and vice versa. Thank you for watching. Please let me know if you agree or disagree with these 3 points, if you think there's something I missed, if you have any recommendations for books, fantasy novels by Latinx authors, if there's something specific you would want me to cover in my next video, and if you're new to this channel, introduce yourself. I'd love to get to meet you. Please like and subscribe. I post new videos every Wednesday. I'll see you next week.